To see why DID may be misdiagnosed as schizophrenia, we need to look at the DSM-5-TR, the official book of diagnostic criteria for mental health in the United States. A diagnosis of schizophrenia requires that at least 2 of 3 possible symptoms be present. These symptoms are delusions, hallucinations, and disorganized speech. There are additional requirements for a diagnosis, but the presence of 2 of those 3 symptoms are foundational requirements. Let's start with delusions, often a key feature of schizophrenia. Delusions, as defined, are beliefs which are untrue and which cannot be changed despite proof to the contrary. To give an example, if it is a clear sunny day and a person is adamant that it's raining even after going outside and being in the sun, then this person is said to have a delusion. One example of delusions provided in the DSM-5-TR is a kind called thought withdrawal, where people believe that their thoughts have been removed by an outside force. Now, there is a phenomena in DID, often called thought snatching, where one part's thoughts vanish, taken away by another part. If you are paying close attention, you might notice that unlike with schizophrenia, where a person is claiming thoughts are controlled from the outside, a person with DID would attribute this to another internal part, if, that is, they were aware that the other parts could do this. A mental health professional who is hurrying to make a diagnosis could easily hear this as a symptom for schizophrenia, even though it is specifically addressed in the section about DID in the DSM-5-TR. Another type of delusion is called delusions of control and involves the belief that one's body or actions are being acted on or manipulated by some outside force. In DID, a common phenomena is for a fronting part, often the host, to say that they don't feel like they're in control of the actions or speech of the body. They will report that they tried unsuccessfully to intervene and stop actions or stop speech with no success. However, I've never heard any claim that it was due to some outside force. Instead, they understood that they were not the part in the driver's seat at that moment. They were co-conscious to some extent, but were not in control of the body. That's very different from a schizophrenic person's experience. But, again, a careless or hurried mental health professional might miss this distinction. A third type of delusion, which can easily be confounded with events in DID, is the persecutory delusion. People with this delusion believe that they are going to be harmed or harassed by individuals or organizations. Again, these are outside forces the schizophrenic person believes will be acting on them, even without any evidence. Contrast that to a person with DID who has young parts who experienced profound abuse and who may be fronting but unaware that years have passed since their abuse. They are stuck back in the trauma. It's easy to see how they could be terrified of being hurt and how someone who did not understand this as DID could attribute this to a delusion. Or it could be that the person with DID is experiencing a flashback, reliving a past trauma in the present moment. This too could be viewed as a delusion since the person is clearly not being abused in the present moment. Hallucinations are another of the 3 symptoms, of which 2 must be present for a diagnosis of schizophrenia. In the DSM-5-TR, it describes hallucinations as perception-like experiences that occur without an external stimulus. They are vivid and clear, with the full force and impact of normal perceptions and not under voluntary control. Hallucinations can be experienced in any sensory modality, but are most commonly auditory in nature, followed by visual. Auditory hallucinations often occur as voices, which may be known voices or voices that are unfamiliar. This is a key statement in the DSM-5-TR section on schizophrenia. These voices are, quote, are perceived as distinct from the individual's own thoughts, unquote. I bet you can see how this is problematic when it comes to DID. Hearing voices is extremely common in DID. In fact, it's more common in DID than in schizophrenia. Of course, I wouldn't call it a delusion in DID because these voices are real and people can communicate with the voices in their systems. People with DID may also see things which they understand cannot be there, but which they still see. People aren't as familiar with visual hallucinations and might immediately think of schizophrenia, despite the fact that the person with DID knows that what they're seeing isn't really there. In this case, it's more of a flashback than a hallucination. But imagine a person who has DID and has been admitted into an inpatient program. The psychiatrist probably spends all of 15 minutes with this person. The person shares that she hears voices in her head, but they aren't her thoughts. If she shares that the voices are telling her to kill herself, the psychiatrist will likely call this a command hallucination without even considering DID. The psychiatrist can easily believe that he or she has found the required 2 symptoms for a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Another symptom that can be present in schizophrenia, but is not required, is that of catatonia. Catatonia can be present in different ways, and the one that is most familiar is probably that of a person who is unmoving, perhaps in a contorted position, and unresponsive to anything going on around them. Catatonia can also be present as, quote, a marked decrease in reactivity to the environment. And it can include, quote, a complete lack of verbal and motor responses. If you are familiar with polyvagal theory at all, you might realize right away that something else would appear like this: hypoarousal. Hypoarousal is one of the nervous system's defenses, like fight or flight. In hypoarousal, the person is basically overwhelmed and checked out, not really aware of what is happening around them. This state doesn't just happen, it would need a trigger. But in that inpatient setting, with the hurried assessment, it's possible the doctor wouldn't notice that a particular question or topic preceded the shutdown. If they don't, all they see is that the person is no longer responding, or barely responding, and they may attribute it to the catatonia and to schizophrenia. The DSM-5-TR also notes that, quote, hostility and aggression can be associated with schizophrenia. I have yet to meet a system which doesn't have an angry, hostile, or aggressive part, for good reason. Imagine that system finding themselves in the noisy, busy inpatient setting, scared and not knowing what's going on. It's possible that a fearful part could front, but I think it's more likely that a protective and angry, aggressive, or hostile part might front. A careless or busy clinician could easily chalk this up to schizophrenia. Research has been done on this topic, comparing diagnoses of what they called schizophrenic spectrum disorders. This includes some of the schizophrenic light diagnoses and dissociative disorders, not just DID. And while some studies found no instances of people being diagnosed with both, other studies found that between 9 and 50% of schizophrenic spectrum patients also met the criteria for dissociative disorders. One study showed that in a sample of patients diagnosed with DID, 74.3% also met the diagnostic criteria for a schizophrenic spectrum disorder. 49.5% met the diagnostic criteria for schizoaffective disorder, and 18.7% met the criteria for schizophrenia. To my mind, anyone diagnosed with schizophrenia or one of the schizophrenic spectrum disorders would be well advised to be assessed for DID by someone who is an expert in DID. Now here's where I think the DSM-5-TR really messes up. In what are called the differential diagnoses, for each condition listed in the book, there is a section which lists other conditions which must be ruled out. Those are the differential diagnoses. It seems obvious to me that DID should be one of those conditions which must be ruled out before making a diagnosis of schizophrenia. But unbelievably, DID is not one of the conditions that are listed to be ruled out. If you look at DID, however, you will find that schizophrenia is one of the differential diagnoses to be ruled out prior to diagnosing DID. Explain the sense to me that one must be ruled out in one direction, but not the other. Truthfully, I think even if DID was a differential diagnosis to be ruled out for schizophrenia, it likely wouldn't make much difference unless the clinician was taking time and care to explore the root of the symptoms that could belong to either schizophrenia or DID. But without DID being one of the issues on the list to be ruled out, it might not occur to some clinicians, and so it doesn't happen. One underlying thread through this is context. Context is what determines how the symptom should be interpreted. Going back to my example of the fronting part of a DID system reporting that they have no control over the body, without looking into the symptom more carefully, it might be missed that the alter is not claiming someone outside the body is controlling her body. Context is overlooked when the clinician doesn't have adequate time to spend with the person before making a diagnosis. And context is overlooked if the diagnosing clinician simply refuses to entertain the possibility of DID as a diagnosis. So, what do you think about this? Leave your comments below and I'll respond to them.